Our gospel text today comes from the 21st chapter of Luke, verses 25 through 36, and Jesus is speaking. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard, so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day does not catch you unexpectedly, like a trap. For it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Let me share a story that I find inspiring. It's not a Bible story. It's a tale from Mark Twain, whose birthday, by the way, was yesterday, 189 years ago. This tale is called Jim Baker's Blue Jay Yarn. I wish that I could just read it to you because only Twain can really tell it, but here is the gist. A blue jay lands on the roof of an abandoned house, and in that roof he sees a knothole. He examines it carefully, declares it a perfectly elegant hole, gets an acorn, and drops it in. And he quickly waits to hear it land. And he hears nothing. Disappointed, he tries again and again. And after many efforts, he says to the hole, well, you're a long hole and a deep hole and a mighty singular hole altogether, but I've started to fill you, and I'm darned, Twain does not say darned, I'm darned if I won't fill you if it takes 100 years. For hours, the jay flies back and forth with acorns, but at last, having failed even to hear an acorn hit bottom, he collapses against the chimney of the house, swearing as only a jay can swear. One by one, other blue jays gather around to discuss the situation. And finally, one wise old jay flies down to the door of the house, which is standing open, and he looks in. And he sees acorns scattered all over the floor. And he cries, come here, everybody. Hanged if this fool hasn't been trying to fill up a house with acorns. And the other jays swoop down for a look. They hang around laughing for about an hour. Some of them fall off the door because they're laughing so hard. And for the next few years, blue jays and other birds come by to visit the house themselves and have a good laugh over it. Only one old owl, who stops by on his way back from Yosemite, says that he can't see anything funny in it, but as Twain says, he was a good deal disappointed about Yosemite too. Now, Twain was not one to moralize, and he hated cheap sentimentality. But since he is not here, I'm going to borrow his story to make a point. Doing good in the world can be something like trying to fill up a house with acorns. Drop as many good deeds as we will down the hole before us, we will never fill up the house. We won't even hear the acorns land. Sometimes we can feel that everything we do is simply part of the over and overness of life, which itself can overwhelm us, day leading to day and season to season. First it's January, then it's February, then all of a sudden it's almost Christmas, And then the calendar just starts over, giving us plenty to schedule, but no context whatsoever just for what it means to get from January to January. Fortunately, for context, we have the church year. Beginning today with the first Sunday of Advent, the church year tells a story that starts with anticipation of Christ's coming and ends with his rise to the heavenly throne. Within that context, our lives are transformed, not just a series of events happening over and over, but a meaningful contribution within a divine story. But if the church year begins in anticipation, then Jesus' words in Luke 21 are unsettling, because what he anticipates is disaster. Just before the text that I read today, he foretells the destruction of the temple, followed by wars, famines, plagues, persecutions, and finally the horrible end of the city of Jerusalem. And then, now we're at the verses you just heard me read, will come signs in the heavens, chaos like a storm at sea, fear and foreboding and fainting. Over centuries, these texts have inspired a lot of speculation about the so-called end time. The basis for that speculation is a question from Jesus' followers. When, Lord? When will these things happen? And what are the signs? Always some would-be prophet is moving Jesus' words out of their context and into our calendar, matching them up to events in history or the present to come up with an answer. And this type of prophet will always find an answer. Because in this world, anyone looking for wars, plagues, famines, and persecutions can always find them. And so, we come to Advent, a season that begins in darkness. The darkness of a world where daily life often feels like a repeating series of wars, famines, plagues, and persecutions. Not to mention the abuse of power and the prevalence of greed, themes of many of the stories that precede this very text in Luke. Advent anticipates the coming of Christ to bring us out of all of that. Lighting our first candle today symbolizes our first tentative step out of darkness. We are, however, going to need a lot of encouragement to move forward. So in today's verses, Jesus ends with a grand vision of triumph to come. After chaos, after fear, and the shaking of the heavenly powers will come a vision of the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And then, says Jesus, stand up and raise your heads because your redemption is drawing near. But, all those predictions of the end of the world, all those would-be prophets calculating dates for the return of Christ, none of them have been right. Here we still are, with wars and famines and plagues and persecutions coming again and again in a repeated series, like a calendar that just keeps returning to the beginning, over and over. Like a calendar and not like a story, because in a story the end would come. Will it ever come? What are the signs of redemption? Looking around today, what we see instead is even more war, even more famine, even more darkness. If we can't see redemption coming, well, in the midst of wars and famines and plagues and persecutions, we'd be satisfied with just getting back to normal. Lord, when will we get back to normal? But the Advent promise is not that the world will return to normal. Think of what it says in the book of Isaiah. The wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the lion shall eat straw like an ox. The coming of God's kingdom will not get things back to normal. The coming of God's kingdom will turn them upside down. Our hope as we wait for the coming of the kingdom should not be for things to get back to normal, but for them to get radically different. And yet, hope as we may, the terrors that Jesus described keep happening over and over, reliably as the passing of the seasons or the coming of night. If we are not to know when these terrors will end, then Lord, give us some guidance on how to live meaningfully in an ongoing series of repeating and even escalating terrible events. When a text is as challenging as today's reading, it's often helpful to read it in a larger context. So what was going on in the previous chapters? Now here's where things get really interesting. Between the stories about power and greed and today's text about destruction and signs, here is what happens. Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." Just as his followers were about to throw themselves into a search for signs of destruction and darkness, Jesus pointed out another kind of sign altogether. If we are looking for signs of redemption, this is where we should focus: on acts of faithfulness, acts of generosity, acts of love arising from the love of God. Every such act is a sign of God's triumph, a sign that God triumphs even now. We should not only be looking for those signs, we should be creating them. But our good deeds, our acts of love, they're so small, aren't they? We've just been doing them over and over, and they don't seem to make a difference. Do we really have the capacity to create signs of redemption? More than a dozen years ago, I found inspiration in Jim Bakker's Blue Jay yarn. Working as a chaplain at Baptist Hospital, I saw a parallel between my work and the Blue Jays. No matter how many visits I made, how many patients I talked to, how many prayers I prayed, in that huge hospital, each act amounted to no more than an acorn dropped down the knothole into a house. I was never going to fill up the house. And instead of discouraging me, that realization set me free. The very impossibility of my task set me free. I was free to do my work with joy because I was free from the illusion that if I just worked harder, I would meet everybody's needs. I was not called to fill up the house. I was just called to keep winging in the acorns, all that I had. When the widow dropped in her 2 little copper coins, how many people laughed? "Come here, everybody. Hanged if this little lady isn't trying to fill up the treasury with 2 sorry little coins." But maybe the impossibility set her free. Free to offer this act of faithfulness, to which we should pay attention, because every act of faithfulness is a sign that God's redemption is ongoing and that the story ends in triumph. In the last verses of today's text, Jesus says, "Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and worries of this life." In other words, be not normal. Dissipation, drunkenness, worry, these are normal reactions when bad stuff just seems to keep happening over and over. But Jesus calls us to be not normal. to keep joyfully throwing in our acorns or our little copper coins, not because we can fill up the world, but because it gives us joy to throw in what we have. Maybe in this present age, our small acts of faithfulness are all the sign the world will see that the story ends in triumph. Winging in an acorn, tossing in a little coin, lighting a single candle. We perform these acts within the context of the divine story, the story that we retell in the church year over and over. Christ is born again and again, lives again and again, dies again and again, and is resurrected again and again. We tell this story to tell the world that whatever the times of our lives, whatever the signs of our times, everyone who has ever lived and everyone who will ever live is held within this divine story of God's love. And God's love rises in the person of Jesus Christ to triumph over and over. Amen.